Hello folks, and welcome to Noob-Splaining. I hope you're ready for part 2 of the original Deathwing origins. So settle in and get ready for another story time with Wulf. I'm not going to mess around with a long preamble, but if you haven't seen the part 1 yet, pause this video and go watch it. Right, let's get on with this, shall we? Two heads talking saw a commotion break out across the square. A squad of bluecoats forced the main beggars to one side. People were crushed underfoot as they pushed through the throng like a blade through flesh. The librarian dropped back towards the entrance of a tavern. A surly Bravo with fresh scarred cheeks came too close. He raised his truncheon to strike Two Heads Talking, obviously perceiving him as one of the throng. It bounced off the carapace of his Terminator armour. The bluecoat squinted in astonishment at him and then slowly backed away. A palanquin borne by two squat, shaven-headed men in brown uniforms moved through the path cleared by the bully boys. Two Heads Talking looked at the sign of a four-armed man on each side, and a thrill of fear passed through him. His worst suspicions were justified. "Alms! Elder, give us alms!" the crowd pleaded, voices merging into one mighty roar. Many had abased themselves and kneeled, stumps and grasping hands outstretched in supplication towards the palanquin. A curtain inside was pulled back, and a short fat man stepped out. His pale skin had a bluish tint, and he was wearing a rich suit of black cloth, a white waistcoat and high black leather boots. A four-armed pendant dangled from a chain hanging around his neck. His head was totally hairless, and he had piercing black eyes. He gazed out at the crowd and smiled gloatingly, great jowls rippling backward to give him a dozen small chins. He reached down and found a purse. The crowd held its breath expectantly. For a second, his gaze fell on the librarian, and he looked puzzled. A frown crossed his face. Two Heads Talking felt a tug on his leg and fell to one knee. Although it went against the grain to kneel to anything except the image of the Emperor, he felt that malign glance linger upon him, and wondered whether the fat man had somehow penetrated his bound spirit's disguise. All the squads gathered around the fire. The great logs smouldered in the dark, underlighting the faces of the Marines, making them look demonic. Behind them, Deathwing sat on its landing claws, a bulwark against the darkness. He knew that beyond it lay the city of their enemy, where dwelled abomination. Nearest the fires squatted the squad leaders, faces impassive. Behind them were their men, in full battle regalia, stormbolters and flamers near at hand. Firelight glittered on the winged swords painted on their shoulder pieces. Their garb was imperial, but the scarred faces that showed in the firelight belonged to the plains people. He had known these men for so long that not even Two Heads Talking could have done a better job of reading their mood. In each stern visage he saw a thirst for vengeance and a desire for death. The warriors wished to join their clansmen in the spirit realm. Cloudrunner too felt the tug of his ancestral spirits, their clamour to be avenged. He tried to ignore their voices. He was a soldier of the Emperor. He had other duties than just to his people.
"We must fight,"
said Weasel Fierce.
"The dead demand it. Our clans need to be avenged. If any of our people survive, they must be liberated. Our honour must be reclaimed." "There are many kinds of honour,"
responded Blue Moon.
"We honour the Emperor. Our Terminator suits are the badge of our honour. They are signs of the honour our chapter does us. Can we risk losing all traces of our chapter's ancient heritage to the Stealers? For 100 centuries, the armour we wear has borne Marines safely through battles. The suits will not fail us now,"
replied Weasel Fierce hotly.
"We can only add to their honour by slaughtering our foe. Brother Marius, Brother Paulo, pray, silence,"
Cloudrunner said, invoking formality by the use of chapter ritual and calling Weasel Fierce and Bloody Moon by the names they had taken on when they had become Marines. The two Terminators bowed their heads, acknowledging the gravity of the moment.
"Forgive us, Brother Captain, and name penance. We are at your service. Semper Fidelis,"
they replied.
"No penance is necessary."
Cloudrunner looked around the fire. All eyes were upon him. He weighed his words carefully before he spoke again.
"We are gathered tonight, not as soldiers of the Emperor, but by ancient custom, as warriors of the people. To this I give my blessing, as Captain and War Chief. We are here as speakers for our clans, joined in brotherhood, so that we might speak with one voice, think as one mind, discern the correct path for all our peoples."
Cloudrunner knew his words rang false. Those present were not speakers for their clans. They were the clans, all that was left. Still, the ritual had been invoked, and must be kept to.
Within this circle there will be no violence. Till the ending of this gathering, we will be as one clan.
It was strange to speak those words to warriors who had fought together in 1,000 battles under 100 suns. Yet it was the ancient rite of meeting, meant to ensure peaceful discourse among the warriors of rival tribes. He saw some Marines nod. Suddenly it felt right. The ways their people had been born in this world. And while they were here, they would keep to them. In this time and space, they were bound by the ties of their common heritage. Each needed the reassurance after the trials of the day.
We must speak concerning the fate of our world and our honour as warriors. This is a matter of life and death. Let us speak honestly, according to the manner of our people.
The elder fondled its chain of office and continued to stare at Two Heads talking. A frown creased its high, bulbous forehead. Abruptly it looked away and fumbled in its purse. A ragged cheer went up from the crowd as he threw handfuls of gleaming iron tokens out at them, then withdrew into his palanquin to witness the scramble. The Marine watched people grovel in the dust, scrabbling for coins. He shook his head in disgust as he entered the tavern. Even the most debased hive-world dweller would have shown more dignity than the rabble outside. The place was nearly empty. Two Heads Talking looked around at the packed earth floor and the crudely made tables over which slouched a few ragged, unwashed drunks. The walls were covered in rough hangings, which repeated a stylized four-armed pattern made to look like a crude star. Outside, in the distance, he heard the long, lonely wail of a steam whistle. The innkeeper leaned forward against the counter, guts streaming against the bar top. Two Heads Talking walked over to him. As he reached the counter, he realised that he had no tokens. The innkeeper stared at him coldly, rubbing one stubbled, broken-veined cheek with a meaty paw. "Well?" he demanded peremptorily. "What do you want?" Two Heads Talking was surprised by the man's rudeness. The people had always been a polite folk. It paid to show courtesy when an offended party might hit you with a stone axe. He met the man's gaze levelly and exerted a portion of his will. He met no resistance from the man's weak spirit, but even so, the effort was fatiguing. The innkeeper turned away, eyes downcast, and poured a drink from a clay bottle without being asked. Outside the doorway came the sound of footsteps. The doors burst open, and a crowd of workers flooded in, bellowing orders for drink. Both men and women had gaunt, tired faces. Their hands and bare feet were as grimy as their clothing. Two Heads Talking guessed that a shift had just ended. He took his drink and sat down in a corner, watching the workers slump down in their chairs, listening to them listlessly curse their overseers and their lack of tokens. A group set up a dice game in the corner and gambled indifferently. After a while, Two Heads Talking noticed that people were drifting through a doorway in the back of the tavern. He rose and followed. No one seemed to object. The room he entered was dark and smelled of animal fat. In its centre was a pit surrounded by cheering, cursing workers. Two Heads made his way forward, and the crowd melted away about him. He stood at the edge of the pit and saw the object of everyone's attention. Down below, two great plains weasels were fighting, ripping long strips of flesh from each other, while the audience roared and bettered. Each was the size of a grown man and wore a spiked metal collar. One had lost an eye. Both were bleeding from dozens of cuts. Two Heads Talking was disgusted. As a youth, he had hunted weasels, matching stone axe against ferocious cunning. It had been a challenge in which the warrior gambled his life against a fierce and deadly adversary. There was no challenge to this cruel sport. It was simply a safe outlet for the bloodlust of these weary, hungry workers. The librarian departed the pit, leaving the workers to their sport. As he left, he noticed that Bluecoat had entered the bar and was talking to the bartender. As he stepped outside, he saw that they were looking in his direction. He hurried into the smoggy night, thinking that he felt inhuman eyes watching him. Cloudrunner looked at the faces around the fire. They were waiting for him to begin. He took 3 deep breaths. By long tradition, he must be the first to speak. A gathering of warriors was not an argument in the formal sense, where words were used as weapons to count coup on the enemy. It was a pooling of experience, a telling of stories. Words must have no sharp edges on which to snag anger. He chose his carefully.
When I was 12 summers old,
He began.
I dwelled in the Yellow Lodge, among the young bucks. It was my last summer there, for I was pledged to marry Running Deer, who was the fairest maiden of my clan. Often, the books would talk of the warriors from the sky, 100 years had passed since their last visit, and the red star was visible in the sky. Their time was near for their return. Hawk Talon, my grandfather's grandfather, had been chosen and taken to the spirit realm to serve the great chief beyond the sky. My bloodline had acquired much honour because of it, although he had left his son fatherless and needing to found a new lodge. Silver Elk was a buck with whom I vied for Running Deer's hand. Because she had chosen me, he hated me. He boasted of how he would be chosen. His words were a taunt, aimed at belittling my kinsman's honour. Silver Elk's own line had no spirits who had ridden Deathwing and ventured beyond the sky. I was stung and responded to his taunts. I said that if that was so, he wouldn't mind climbing Ghost Mountain and visiting the abode of the ancestors.
Cloudrunner paused to let his words sink in, to let the warriors imagine the scene. The memory seemed fresh and clear in his own mind. He could almost smell the acrid wood smoke filling the young men's lodge and see the furs hanging from its ceiling.
That was what Silver Elk had wanted me to say. He sneered and replied that he would go to the mountain if someone would accompany him as a witness. He looked straight at me, and so I was trapped. I could not back out without dishonour. I had to go, or he would have counted coup on me. When she heard, Running Deer begged me not to go, fearing that the spirits would take me. She was a shaman's daughter and had the witching sight. But I was young, with a young man's pride and folly, and so I refused her. Seeing that I could not be swayed, she cut a braid from her hair and wove it about with spells, making it a charm to return me home safely. It was a 3-day trip at Hunter's Walk to Ghost Mountain. Fear was our constant companion. What had seemed possible in the warmth of the lodge seemed dreadful in the cold autumn nights when the moon was full and spirits flitted from tree to tree. I believe that if either of us had been alone, we would have turned back, for it is a terrible thing to approach the places of the restless dead at night as winter approaches. But we could show no fear. The other was witness, and our rivalries rose forward. Neither wanted to be the first to turn back. On the evening of the 3rd day, we met the first warning totems, covered by the skulls of those the Sky Warriors had judged and found wanting. I felt like running then, but pride kept me moving on. We began to climb. The night was still and cold. Things rustled in the undergrowth, and the moon leered down like a witching spirit. Stunted trees haunched over the pathway like malign ghosts. We climbed till we came to the vast empty plateau marked by the sign of the winged skull. We were filled with a sense of achievement, and our enmity was, for the moment, buried. We stood in a place few men had ever seen. We had defied the spirits and lived. Still, we were on edge. I don't know what I thought when Silver Elk pointed upward. There came a howling as of 1,000 roused ghosts, and fire lit the sky. Perhaps I thought the spirits had chosen to strike me down for my presumption. Perhaps I was so filled with terror that I thought of nothing. All I knew, that I was frozen in place, while Silver Elk turned and ran. If I had been afraid before, imagine how I felt when I saw that great winged shape in the distance, and heard the roar of the approaching Thunderbird. Picture my horror when I saw it was Deathwing itself, steed of the Emperor, chooser of the slain, winged, hunting skeleton. I bitterly regretted my folly. I could not move to save myself, and waited for Deathwing to strike me with its claws and release my spirit. I was surprised when the Thunderbird stooped to earth in front of me and ceased its angry roaring. Still, I could not run. Its beak gaped, disgorging the massive black-armoured forms of the chosen dead. On each shoulder they bore the sign of the winged blade. I knew then that I was in the realm of the spirits. For Hawk Talon, my grandfather's grandfather, stood among them. I had seen his face carved on the roof pole of our family lodge. He looked old and grey and tired, but there was still a family resemblance. To see a face so familiar and so strange in that dreadful place was somehow reassuring. It enabled me to overcome my fear. Filled with wonder, I walked forward till I stood before him. That terrible, grizzled old man whose face was so like my own. For what seemed like a long time, he simply stared at me. Then he smiled and started to laugh. He clasped me to his armoured breast and shouted that it was a fortunate homecoming. He seemed just as pleased to me as I was to see him.
Cloudrunner paused, comparing his ancestors' return to his own. There was no laughter here, as there had been amongst those Marines long ago. He understood now how glad the old man had been to see a familiar face. He was glad that Hawk Talon wasn't here to see the destruction of their people.
Of course, I was overwhelmed, standing among these legendary warriors, speaking with my ancient blood relative. I knew they had returned to choose their successors in the Emperor's service, and forgetting everything else, I begged to be allowed to join them. The old man looked at me and asked me whether I had any reason to stay, or any reason to regret going. I thought of running deer, and I hesitated, but I was a coward. Visions of glory and the wonders beyond the sky filled me. What did I truly know of life? I was being called on to make a choice that I would have to live with for centuries, although I did not know it. My ancestor did. He saw my hesitation and told me better to stay in that case, but I would have nothing of it, and insisted that they put me to the test. They strapped me to a steel table and opened my flesh with metal knives. I had endured the weasel claw ritual to prove my bravery, but the pain was nothing to what I then endured. When they opened my flesh once more, they implanted things which they said would bond with my flesh and grant me spirit power. For weeks, I lay in feverish agony while my body changed. The walls danced, and my spirit fled to the edge of the cold place, while I wandered lost and alone. One of the brothers stood beside, reciting the imperial litanies. In a vision, the Emperor came to me, riding Deathwing, mightiest of thunderbirds. It was different from that which had borne the Sky Warriors home. It was a beast of spirit. The other had been a bird of metal, a totem cast in its image. The Emperor spoke to me, telling me of the great struggle being waged on 1,000 worlds. He showed me the other races, the man, and the secret heart of the universe, which is chaos. He showed me the powers that lurked in the war, and exposed me to their temptations. He watched as I resisted. I knew that, if I had given in, he would have struck me down. Eventually, I awoke, and I knew then that my spirit belonged to the Emperor. I had chosen to abandon my people, my world, and my bride for his service. I knew I had made the correct choice.
Cloudrunner glanced around at the other Terminators. He hoped he had told the story well enough to catch his listeners' minds and remind them of their duty to the Emperor. He hoped he had reminded them that they had all made the same decision as he had, and that they would once more make the correct choice. He shook his head and touched the charm of braided hair that he still wore around his throat. He wondered if he had made the correct choice all those years ago, if he would have been happier staying with Running Deer. The bright, bold vision he had possessed in his youth had faded and lost its glamour over the years of endless warfare. I never even said goodbye to her, he thought, and that, somehow, was the saddest thought of all. He judged that he had swayed many of the Marines, but when Lame Bear leaned forward to speak, he knew the struggle had only begun. I would speak of Gene Stealers, the big man said quietly. I would speak of Gene Stealers, their terror and their cruelty. Two heads talking wandered the nighted streets. They seemed empty now that the workers had returned to their barracks. A slight breeze had sprung up, blowing flecks of ash through the streets, clearing the smog slightly. A bitter ash taste filled his mouth. He passed by the factories where giant steam engines stood, still working. Their din filled the air. Their pistons went up and down like the nodding heads of maddened dinosaurs. He knew they never rested. He strode down a street of rich mansions, driven by morbid curiosity. He felt as though he'd been shown the pieces of a vast puzzle, and if he could only locate the last piece, it would all just fall into place. Each mansion he passed had wrought iron gates which bore the signs of the Night Owl, the Puma, and the Rat. These were the totem animals of the Hill clans. Two heads talking wondered whether the chieftain of these people dwelled within. He could well believe that they would make pacts with whoever had done this. Those people had dark reputations. He felt anger grow within him, driving out the sense of bewilderment. His life had been rendered meaningless. His people had been betrayed. His world had been stolen. Even the Dark Angels had been destroyed. 10,000 years of tradition ended here. There were no more bold huntsmen of the plains for the Sky Warriors to recruit. The chapter might continue, but its heritage had been destroyed. It would never be the same again. Two Heads Talking was of the last generation of Marines recruited from the plains people. There would be no more. As he moved beyond the mansions, toward the polluted river, his spirit sensors warned him he was being followed. Part of him did not care, would welcome confrontation with whatever watchers shadowed him. From up ahead, he heard a groan of pain. We do not know where they come from, said Leibert. Not even the curators of the Administrator know that. They appear without warning, carried in the mighty space hulks which drift on the tides of warp space. A shiver passed through even these hardened Terminators. Cloud Runners saw the gaze of those who had faced the Genestealers turn inward. Their faces reflected the grim memories of the encounters. Unconsciously, they sat up straighter and looked around nervously. For the first time, it was brought home to the captain that they really did face the Genestealers once more. They faced a threat that could kill them. They are dreadful foes, ferocious, relentless, knowing neither pity nor fear. They do not use weapons, perhaps because they do not need them. Their claws are capable of tearing adamantium like paper. They do not use armour. Their hides are so tough they can survive, for a time, unsuited in vacuum. They have the aspect of a beast, yet they are intelligent and organised. They are the most terrible enemies any Marine has faced since the time of the Horus Heresy. How do I know this? I have faced them, as have others here. Cloudrunner shivered, recalling the times he faced the Stealers. He remembered their chitinous visage, their gaping jaws and four-rending claws. He tried not to recall their blinding, insect-like speed. It is not their fearsome battle prowess that makes the Stealers such dreadful opponents. It is something else. I will tell you of it. 120 years ago, before even I donned Terminator armor, I was sent with the fleet that investigated the strange silence of the hive world Thranks. The Imperial Governor had not paid tribute for 20 years, and the Adeptus Terra had decided that perhaps a gentle reminder of his sworn duties was in order. The fleet arrived bearing sections from the Dark Angels, the Space Wolves, the Ultramarines, and an Imperial Guard regiment from Necromunda. As the fleet moved into drop position, we expected resistance, rebellion, but the orbital monitors did not fire at us, and the Governor spoke fairly to us on the comlink. He claimed that the world had been cut off by warp storms and orcish raids. He apologised for the non-payment of tribute and offered immediate reparations. He suggested that Inquisitor Van Dam, who was in charge of the punitive expedition, descend and accept his obeisance. We were naturally suspicious, but Van Dam suggested that any chance to take a world back into the Imperial fold without the expense of military action should at least be investigated. He requested the Dark Angels provide an honor guard. We set our locators and teleported down into the Governor's reception hall. Thranks was a world encased in steel. Its natives never saw the sky. The Governor's hall was so vast though that clouds formed under its ceiling and rain fell on the streets that surrounded the ruler's pavilion. It was a sight to stir the blood. Long ranks of guardsmen flanked the curving metal road that led to the pavilion. The pavilion itself floated on suspensors above an artificial lake. The Governor sat on a throne carved from a singly industrially cultured pearl, flanked by two beautiful blind maidens who were his court telepaths. He bade us welcome and showed us the tribute. It was brought from vaults by specially bred slaves, grey-skinned eunuchs with muscles like an ogren's. Even so, they could barely carry the chests. They paraded past us in seemingly endless procession, carrying industrial diamonds, gold inlaid bolters, suits of armoured ceramite and jade. All the time, the Governor, Huak, kept up an endless, amiable chatter. We watched, dazzled and beguiled by his smooth voice and affable manner. As the long day wore on, we began to accept that there was no need to fight. We should simply take the tribute and go home. Our minds were pleasantly befuddled, and we were prepared to agree to anything our gracious host suggested. When the great cryogenic coffins were brought forth, Huak claimed they carried his greatest treasures. It is a measure of how under his sway we were that we almost took them without thinking. It was Two Heads talking who said no. He stood there for a moment, like a man bemused, and then he began to chant. It was as if cobwebs had been lifted from our eyes, and we saw the snare that had been so subtly set for us. The spell of the Magus, for such was Huak, was lifted, and we saw to our horror that we had almost taken two Genestealer coffins back to our fleet. All that afternoon, as our minds had been lulled by the long, slow march, Huak had been inserting subtle, mystical tendrils into our minds. Still, so near to being enthralled were we, that we almost protested when Two Heads talking riddled Huak and his two apprentices with bolter fire. Only the living dreadnought, Hawk Talon, joined in the firing. We reacted slowly when he warned us to defend ourselves. Huak's guardsmen almost had us, but we were Marines. No sooner had they opened up with their las rifles Then we returned fire with our bolters, cutting them down. Van Damme tried to contact the fleet, but our comm links were being jammed and we could not teleport out. There was nothing for it. We had to fight our way to the planet's surface and hope that a dropship could reach us. It seemed as if the whole planet had turned against us, and that was more or less what had happened. 200 of us fought our way out of the audience room. We were met by armed men, unarmed children and their mothers. All threw themselves against us with insane ferocity. We cut them down. They showed no fear, only a strange, unholy joy. The whole damn world had been infected. Our trip to the surface was a nightmare. We battled along dark corridors, crawled up access ladders and through narrow hatches never meant for Marines. I saw Steel Fist tumble back headless from one hatchway. Van Damme lobbed a handful of crack grenades through, and we were spattered with the remains of a full-grown Steeler. My brother Red Sky was pulled down by a wave of feral children with explosives in their hands. They detonated them as they crawled over his body. He did not live. Twice in the endless corridors we were almost overrun. It came to hand-to-hand combat with pure strange Steelers. 20 of our brothers were cut down before Two Heads Talking Force Axe and Cloud Runner's power sword carried us clear. It was while guarding the final hatchway that I lost the use of my leg. A Steeler cut right through the floor and grabbed me, trying to pull me down. I blasted frantically at it. The last thing I remember was its horrid, leering face as it pulled me towards it. Around it was a group of Thranxians who stroked and pushed against it fondly. The others told me what had happened when I woke up in the medical bay of the ship with a new bionic leg. Two Heads Talking and Cloud Runner had pulled me clear and carried me to the roof of the world where the dropship waited. There was only one thing to do. Order the Exterminatus. The whole planet was sterilized from orbit with virus bombs. Later, inquisitorial investigators ascertained that the whole business had begun only 60 years before, when an unrecorded Space Hulk had swung through the system. It took only 3 generations for the Steelers to infect a whole world. That is how they reproduce, by turning people into hosts for their offspring. Their victims endure this willingly due to the Steelers' hypnotic powers. Many nights I have lain awake, wondering whether we could have saved the world, if only we had arrived sooner. Perhaps if we had been able to eliminate the Steelers before the cancer had spread, we would not have had to order the Exterminatus. Cloud Runner could see the warriors had been swayed and angered by Lame Bear's tale. He could tell that they were considering the assimilation of the people as breeding stock, and the possibility of that, by swift action, they might prevent it.
"Let us go,"
said Weasel Fierce, leaping to his feet.
"Let us enter the city and kill the Steeler spawn."
Several of the warriors made to accompany him. "Wait," said Bloody Moon. "The gathering is not over, and I would speak." And I think that will do for part 2.